People, when they're faced with particular problems, often come up with quite innovative solutions. And not everybody comes up with the same one.
The young people, they make most of the strides in research because they're young and fearless. They don't know enough not to do it. Do things that are dangerous. You know, danger is a good thing. Almost everything worth doing in life is risky.
Delegates, please give a huge hero's welcome to Sir Richard Roberts.
Sit down. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see such an enthusiastic audience. Now, I'm going to talk about something that is a little bit sobering, something that you've probably heard a lot about, maybe from your parents, maybe from the television, maybe from your local grocery store. GMOs, something that a particular group has gone out of their way to demonize. I'm going to explain to you exactly what they are, why we need them, and why being against them, in my view, is a crime against humanity. About a year ago, I started a movement with the support of 124 Nobel laureates asking Greenpeace and the Green parties to stop demonizing GMOs and to admit that this was one area where they'd made a mistake. Greenpeace do a lot of good stuff. The environmental parties, the Green parties, do a lot of good stuff. This is an area where they made a big mistake, and they should just admit it. Remember that for the 800 million people in this planet who go to bed hungry every night, food is medicine. They don't care whether they have antibiotics and whether they just want food, and food is incredibly important. Even in this country, there are a lot of people who go to bed hungry at night. Now, food means agriculture. Food means we have to grow it. These fields that you see here, this is something that was developed. It began getting developed 10, 12,000 years ago in the Middle East when the hunter-gatherers realized that instead of going out into the forest and looking for food, they could grow it in their own backyard. And what's happened in the meantime is that they and their successors have slowly improved crops so that the crops that we eat today, that you see growing in the field, are really quite different from the native ancestors. If you look here, you'll see what happened to maize or corn. It depends which side of the Atlantic you live. This, on the very left, is the wild ancestor. It's a tiny, shriveled up little thing. And that has been engineered genetically over the course of the last few thousand years so that it now looks as these beautiful yellow corn cobs that you buy in the supermarket. Quite a difference between the wild ancestor, the thing that got started, and the thing that you now see in the supermarket. This is true for almost every vegetable that you see in the supermarket, on the market stands, or wherever. They've all been engineered genetically, just using old-fashioned methods in order to produce the things that we can eat today. Now, I want to just give you a quick overview, a little bit of science, to give you some idea of what it means to breed plants. Basically, we take a male and a female, cross them, mix the genes completely together in much the way that the genes get mixed when your mother and father had you. And the first round of doing this, you get something that is a big mix of the two parents. And you're looking, in this particular case, with plants for a particular trait. Maybe you want to grow very tall or have good grades. That's the blue. This is the trait that we want. Now, you obviously don't want all of these others, all these yellow things. And so what you do is you cross this first hybrid back to the so-called elite variety, and you keep doing this to try and get rid of as many of the yellow genes as you can. You get rid of most of them, but you can't get rid of all of them, and you select for the ones that have the trait that you want. Now, if you can't get it that way, what the traditional plant breeders have done is to make mutants of the plant. They irradiate them. They put chemicals on them that will mutagenize them in the hope that they can get the trait they want that way. Sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. Now, what are GMOs? What is the GMO method? Well, that is shown here, and I call it precision breeding because GMO doesn't really mean anything. Everything has been genetically modified. But the precision method, the ones that Greenpeace is so worried about, you basically take the gene that you want, the blue gene, you put it in a plasmid, an agrobacterium, it's a bacterial plasmid, and you can transfer that directly to the plant that you want. And this is a natural way in which this particular bacterium moves genes into plants all the time. This is perfectly natural. And this was discovered back in 1975 or so by Mark Van Montague, Jeff Shell, Mary Del Chilton, and a few others. And this was the basis of the GMO method. And so now when we compare the two, you can see that on the left, we're mixing a lot of things and hoping we get what we want, but we don't exactly know what is in that plant. And with the precision method, the GMO method, we know exactly which gene we want, we know where it went in the plant, and this is the method that Greenpeace will tell you is very dangerous, whereas these conventional methods are all very safe. Let me give you an example, something that a lot of people find it easier to understand. This genetics can get a bit complicated. Let's say that I want to move a GPS system from one car to the other. Do I take the two cars apart and then mix them back up and select the one that has the GPS? No, of course I don't. I take the GPS and I move it into the car that wants it. That is the GMO method. This is the precision method of making new crops. But what if I take that same GPS system from an airplane and put it in the car? Does that mean the car's going to fly? Well, the odds are probably not. Even you can figure out that that's not likely to happen. And yet, many of the people who are selling this argument that GMOs are dangerous would have you believe that now the plant is going to fly because it's picked up a gene, say from a fruit fly or from a bird or from some other source. And it's just nonsense. A gene is a piece of DNA, doesn't matter where it comes from. What's important is the product, what comes out at the end of it, not the method. And this is true both for the GMO approach and for traditional breeding. Let me illustrate this with a production line. In a production line, you don't know in this case what is being made. This could be making any number of things. One thing could be a car, one thing could be a tank. The production line is essentially the same, but what comes out is very different. And the same is true when you're making new plants, when you're breeding new plants. You want to look at what comes out, not how it was made. Now, think about plants. A plant is growing out in the field. It can't run away when a bug comes along and tries to eat it, right? We can. If a lion comes and attacks us, we can run away. But plants can't run away. And so, how do they protect themselves? Because if they weren't able to protect themselves, there wouldn't be any plants out there. Well, the answer is they use pesticides. They don't rely upon us to put the pesticides down. They make them themselves, and they're an inherent part of the plant. And this is nicely illustrated by looking at some of the common pesticides that we eat all the time because they're in the crops that we eat. And I just want to focus on items number 3, 4, and 5, celery. Celery, I'm sure you all eat it. I'm sure you all like it. You don't worry about it. If celery was a GMO, they would not be allowed to sell it. And the reason is that celery has in it a compound called psoralen. And psoralen, if you get too much of it onto your skin, it will cause dermatitis. And this is what used to happen to ladies who were chopping up celery to package it up to sell it in supermarkets. And in some cases, not only would they get dermatitis, they would get cancer. Now, you can eat as much celery as you want. The levels of psoralen are relatively low. You have to really bathe yourself in the juice before you have a problem. But this is just an illustration of how natural doesn't necessarily mean safe. You have to test it, find out about it. Turns out there's psoralen, the levels are low, you eat it, your body knows how to take care of it, and it's not a problem. Down on the list, you see Brussels sprouts, mustard, all sorts of things. All of these plants have natural pesticides in them, because if they didn't, they wouldn't have survived during evolution. Now I want to switch to talk about food in developing countries. Here, we don't really have much of a problem. If you go to Europe or you go to the US and you look around, you don't see a lot of thin people walking around. There is plenty of food in Europe. In fact, the only thin people you see are those newly arrived immigrants from Africa who've been trying to get away from the poverty that they face in Africa. And in order to improve crops, you need to breed them. And what's happened is that in the developed countries, in Europe, here, the big agricultural companies have done a lot of work in order to breed the plants to make them better so that they can feed us. In Africa, that has not happened. The big agricultural companies have done nothing, for the most part, for Africa, because there's no money to be made there. Now, with precision agriculture, instead of it taking maybe 10, 15, 20 years to breed a new variety, we can often do that in a very short period of time, maybe in 1 year, maybe in 2 years, sometimes even faster than that. So you might ask, why doesn't Europe endorse precision agriculture? Why don't they think that GMOs are a good thing? And of course, whenever you want to ask why people do things, you start to look at politics, you start to look at money, and in this case, you have to look at both. Okay, it turns out that the Europeans attacked GMOs and attacked big agriculture because they didn't want big agriculture to be taking over the food supply in Europe. And they were worried that Monsanto and these other companies were simply going to wipe out the local farmers, would take over agriculture, and they wondered how they could stop that. Well, the one thing that they couldn't do is they cannot ban Monsanto or these big agribusinesses from selling seeds in Europe, because this is where they get their regular seeds from that provide all of their food. And so what were they going to do? They said, this precision agriculture, these GMOs, they could be really dangerous. And so they began to build scenarios in which they called them frankenfoods. And they got people very worried that there were going to be dire consequences from eating these things. But of course, they then say, well, in that case, we're going to ban them. And then politically, this can be very good. If you look at your politicians, you'll see most of them are trying to protect you from risk. They'll say, oh, here's something very scary, vote for me, I'll save you from it. And the best thing here was that it had no economic consequences whatsoever for Europe. Now, if we start to look at the science behind all of this, as I showed you earlier, it's actually very straightforward to make these GM plants. And in fact, if we look at all the major scientific societies in the world, of which a list is started on the left-hand side of this slide, every single one of them has come out, and the scientists there have said, these are safe, GMOs are safe. The only people who are negative are a couple of academies or institutes that have really been based on anti-GMO principles to start with. Every other scientific society says, yes, these things are safe, as do 124 Nobel laureates. Now let me tell you why this is so important for the developing countries. And the banana problem is a good one. In Uganda, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Tanzania, bananas are a very major food source. 30% of all of the calories in Uganda that are eaten come from bananas. And now there is a disease that is affecting bananas called Xanthomonas wilt, and there is no natural resistance to it in any banana plant that is known, and there are some 500 varieties of bananas. But in sweet peppers are resistant, and 2 genes have been found in sweet peppers, and if you move those 2 genes into bananas, now the bananas are resistant. But that makes GMO bananas, and that is a problem, because in sub-Saharan Africa, there are no laws out there saying how one could grow bananas, GMO bananas, legally. Another emerging threat, which is really very dangerous, is something called the fall armyworm. It's not actually a worm, it's a caterpillar. And the moth, when it lays its eggs, one moth will produce 1,000 eggs, all of which develop into caterpillars, and the caterpillars love corn. And they used to eat their way through the southern states in the US until a GM solution was found called BT corn, rather. BT is a toxin that's found in bacteria. It's all over the place. It's the toxin that organic farmers use in order to spray their crops and stop things from eating them. The BT corn has the gene put into the corn, and now it is resistant. This is a particular problem in places like Zimbabwe. There are 130,000 hectares of corn growing in Zimbabwe, all at danger because of this disease. And Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe in particular, has decided it's too dangerous to grow GMOs. He won't allow them. In Bangladesh, there was a problem, and they made something called the BT eggplant. They put this BT gene into eggplants. They call it brinjal over there. See, nice-looking eggplants. These are completely resistant to the bugs that used to eat them. In Hawaii, a number of years ago, there was a big problem because of a ring spot virus. Scientists at the University of Hawaii made a resistant form of papaya plants, and now 80% of the papayas coming out of Hawaii are actually GM papayas. If you go to the store and buy them, you'll probably be eating these. This saved the Hawaiian crop. But in Thailand, which now has exactly this same problem with papayas, the GM solution is banned. They're not allowed to do it. And so what are the farmers doing? They go to Hawaii and get seedlings from Hawaii, and now they're growing them in Thailand. The farmers really have a much better approach to how to do things than in other people. Now, another problem that we face comes with nutrition. Nutrition is something that we can improve in plants. There is a major problem around the world with vitamin A deficiency in poor countries. Vitamin A is made from something called beta-carotene, and beta-carotene is something you get from carrots, it's something you can get from a variety of things, but you cannot get it from rice. And so Ingo Petricus and Peter Bayer said, well, let's make a GM rice that will produce beta-carotene. Called it golden rice. It became a reality in 1999, and it could have been in the field within 2 to 5 years, beginning to save children from blindness and death. But it's a GMO, and it's something that Greenpeace found particularly challenging, because here is something that really looks like a medicine. It's producing vitamin A that you might otherwise go and buy from in tablet form or whatever. And so they've gone out of their way to stop it. They've done everything possible to stop the development of golden rice, but it's about to become a reality. So since 2002, as many as 15 million children have died or suffered because of vitamin A deficiency. Imagine if that had taken place in Rwanda as a result of a genocide. These people would be in jail. How many have to die before we consider that what's going on with the anti-GMO movement is a crime against humanity? We have to remember that food choice is a luxury of the developed world. If you don't want to eat foods coming from GM sources, then don't. But don't pretend they're dangerous, because not only are they not dangerous, they're probably safer than the traditional foods that you eat all the time. You do not have to worry about GM foods. We have something like 25 years of experience now growing GM crops of people and animals eating them. There is not one incident in which it's been a problem. Not one. So the answer is that for developed countries, food isn't a problem. And if we're going to start politicizing certain methods for producing our food, let's not forget the consequences of our actions for the developing countries. Because what happens is that Greenpeace are rushing off to the developing countries, telling them that these things are too dangerous, they shouldn't do it. We need more science in politics, and as a side, we could do with some less politics in science. Politicians need to listen to the scientists they fund. We spend a lot of money on research. Stop supporting the idea that foods produced by GMO methods are dangerous. Remove this paragraph from the EU, which says the EU should not support GMO research in Africa. Civil society, too, should play a part. The religious leaders should speak out. The Rotary clubs, and so on, and knowledgeable scientists should not be silenced. And finally, I will leave you with this cartoon, this slide saying, have a heart. If you look at people on the left, this little boy has a choice of what he wants to buy. The poor children on the right have no choice, they just want food. And GMO is an indulgence of the West. It's not dangerous. And if you want to join the Nobel campaign or find out more about it, go to this website, supportprecisionagriculture.org. Thank you.
Dr. Richard Roberts, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Thank you so much. All right, let's bring Jack Andraka back to the stage. Come on up, Jack. Give it up for Jack. Go ahead, put him in.
You want to take this?
All right, sir. We'll put you right here. We'll put you right there,
Jack.
Jack.
Might as well put you to work.
And take it away.
So that was an incredible talk, first off. And you mentioned some very interesting things in there. And I'm now getting more into some anthropology, and some people out there are also interested in anthropology. And so they're wondering, how do these GMOs impact these kind of cultures and societies that are already in place? How do they act upon those cultures, and how does that impact how they're taken up, how these interventions are taken up? Because we saw in the Ebola epidemic that if you don't consider culture, oftentimes it can lead to disastrous impacts.
So really, this is an emotional issue, not a scientific issue. And what's happened is you have a group of people who basically have ignored the science along the way, and now they use it as a way of scaring people. And maybe when GMOs were first developed, you could argue, well, yes, we do need a little more work. We do need to find out what are the impacts of these things. But the science has been done, but it's being ignored by the Green parties. And it's time that they just said, hey, we tried it, we were right, we said you should do more work on this, but now the work has been done, they're safe, and they should back off.
Now, another big trend in biotech, especially in the past couple of years, has been CRISPR. And so how has that impacted the world of GMOs, and oftentimes how they're viewed by a lot of these governments and regulations?
Right, so CRISPR is just yet a more precise way of making these changes in plants. And what's happened is that both governments and the Green parties have not yet decided whether to be against them or for them. And I think this is actually quite telling because they do not look like a typical GMO as has been defined in the past, even though GMO doesn't really mean anything. And CRISPR provides both a cleaner way of doing things and also a faster way of doing things. And so it, too, is going to have a big impact in agriculture. But you have to recognize that over the last 10, 15 years, there have been an awful lot of developments using non-CRISPR techniques, and you don't want to have to repeat them all again with CRISPR. That would be a waste of time and money. And so we should use CRISPR for new methods, doing new plants, maybe plants that have not been tackled by the old methods.
And so when we're trying to get these new regulations passed, trying to push back against kind of this anti-science fervor that's kind of becoming more commonplace, do you think scientists should really engage in politics, or should they kind of build a bit of a wall between them and politics? Because I know the March of Science, a lot of people said, don't do it because then that mixes science and politics.
Well, I think the bottom line is if scientists do not get up and talk about this, then they're actually doing a disservice to the general public, because the scientists are the people who actually know about this stuff, and I think it's very important that they do stand up and talk about it. And you can talk about it without making it directly political. You can talk about it by saying, here is the science, here's what we know, but equally you know that very often you have to hit the emotions too. The science just doesn't tell it. But if I tell you that there are 2 million children who die every year because they don't get enough vitamin A, I think everybody can see that that's not a good thing. You remember insulin, which diabetics take, and I'm sure there are many diabetics in this audience. Insulin comes from a GMO. It comes from a yeast into which the human gene for insulin has been put. This is where you get your insulin from. No one has complained about that. And why? Because it's a medicine. And that's why they've been so against vitamin A and beta-carotene and golden rice, because that looks as though it's a medicine.
So how do you think these Congress participants, as future doctors and medical scientists, what do you think they can do now to kind of help out with this issue?
Okay, so I think there are many things they can do. Last year, I offered to send my slides to anybody who wanted them. One of the things you can do is go and talk to your local communities, talk to your parents, talk at schools, present your colleagues and friends with the facts, and don't listen to all of this anti-GMO stuff that is not based on good science. My concern is that the science is good. We know a lot about the science. So go out, be active, and sign on to our campaign. If you go to this website, supportprecisionagriculture.org, you can join the Nobel laureates. There's a sign there. You can just sign up, say you're a student, and you can join us. We have a very large number of students already who have joined us. Be active.
Now, one of the big kind of roadblocks we've kind of seen with communicating these science ideas, especially for the mass media, is that scientists often cannot break down a lot of these details, especially for a lay audience. So how big of a factor do you think that is? And how much do you think scientists and doctors should really engage in improving their communication skills, like with public speaking and writing, in order to get their points across? How important do you think that is?
Okay, I think when you can do it, it is very good to do it, but we don't necessarily have to have everybody do it. But let's find those people who are really good at it and get them in front of the media, get them in front of people. People like Alan Alda, who is a wonderful communicator, used to run this Scientific American Frontiers show. He actually has a department down at Stony Brook in which he teaches people how to communicate. And actually, communication usually is a good sign of whether you really understand the science yourself. If you understand the underlying science, it's actually fairly easy often to show what's what. That's why I use the car analogy, because here is something that everybody can understand. You know, you're not going to take two cars apart in order to move a GPS system into a new car. You're just going to do it in a precise way. And I think every time that there are new scientific advances, they can be broken down into very simple speech that everybody can understand.
So looking forward towards the kind of future of these genetic technologies, what do you think? Because, I mean, we're seeing all of these new technologies come out, especially in the wake of CRISPR, where basically anyone can do this on their kitchen countertop almost. So what sort of regulations should we place upon these like new genetic medicines in order to protect the public? Because certainly there is some protection, but also we need to have some leeway.
So I think the key thing here is to recognize, and whoever is writing the legislation should recognize, that traditional methods, as well as the more advanced methods all the way through CRISPR, it is not the method that's important, it's the final product. So if you're going to be doing some testing, test the final product and do it for traditional plants every bit as you would for CRISPR or GMOs or whatever. As I told you, GMO, the GMO method, and CRISPR, if anything, they're safer than any of these traditional breeding methods. When you mix two genomes, you don't know what genes are going to come out in the far end, and you can only test for those that you know to look for. Whereas with these more precise methods, you know what to look for. You know where it went, you can check it, you can see what effect it's had.
Now, everyone in the audience wants to get involved with medicine in some way. So what advice could you give to them as future doctors and scientists on, first, how to succeed, but also how to make sure that their technologies don't run into the same barriers as GMOs?
Well, you know, the big problem with GMOs was the way that Monsanto, big agribusiness, rolled it out in the first place. And I suspect that anytime anybody wants to do something new, you need to be very careful and think carefully about how you're going to roll it out so that you can make sure that the general public, as well as your colleagues and the journalists, all understand what is going on, and you don't try to slip things through in which you're just doing it for money instead of explaining what you're doing. Transparency is a wonderful thing, no matter whether it's a new medical treatment, a new food, or some new device for your iPhone.
Well, thank you so much for all of your work.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Dr. Richard Roberts, right this way, sir. Thank you so much. One more time.